Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to have here a great speaker and colleague and friend of mine, Scott Shackelford. Scott is a professor at Indiana University, associate professor, and he's director of the Ostrom Workshop program on cybersecurity and internet governance there. He also is the chair of IU's cybersecurity program and has been a fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford and at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs Cyber Project at Harvard. And just is back from there, actually, this year. And he is going to be speaking to you about an issue that is timely for everyone interested in this field, about election hacking and how to make democracy harder to hack. It's my real pleasure to introduce Scott.
Good morning, everyone. It's working okay? Good morning. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much for the kind introduction as well, Jackie. It's an honor. It's a privilege to be here with all of you. We're going to be talking about an issue that maybe you've heard a little bit about in the news lately. So in case it's not, thanks for making the stretch and giving this a try. Right up front, I wanted to mention that by no stretch of the imagination do I pretend to have all the answers when it comes to this topic, or even, frankly, to know all the right questions to ask. I've been helped by all my co-authors on this paper, which represent a lot of the intellectual capital at the Belfer Center. I'll introduce them in a second. But I look forward to having just a great discussion about this project, about this topic, and then kind of where we go from here, particularly as it relates to other related issues like critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity due diligence. So just a little bit of background so you know where I'm coming from, my own background on this topic before we dig into the main piece for today. As Jackie kindly mentioned, I'm heading up a new program on cyber and internet governance at the Ostrom Workshop. Has anybody heard of Elinor Ostrom before? She won the Nobel Prize in Economics back in 2009. First woman to do so, still only woman to do so. That'll change soon, I hope. In part for her work on how we can do a better job at managing global collective action problems like climate change from the bottom up, right? So we're trying to apply some of her work now to cybersecurity and internet governance, trying to operationalize a little bit what Joe Nye, Professor Nye, has done with the cyber regime complex, which, as you can tell up there, is a little complex, right? Because the way the internet is governed is quite chaotic in a lot of ways, but it seems to work relatively well. We're researching ways to help it make it work that much better, like by instituting different governance best practices. That's the main topic of our first colloquium coming up later this month. That's going to be live streamed. We're going to have some fun events. Jackie will be there, so you know it's going to be good. And we also have the former director of ICANN giving a talk on the polycentric internet governance ecosystem. Polycentric just means how can we get multiple centers of authority and power to work well together around a common topic, right? The other issue I have to plug, because it's in my contract, is I am now the chair of this program. Boy, do I have the Cybersecurity Masters for you, if you're looking for one, right? This is a new tie-up between our business, our law, and computer science faculties. Students take core courses in each one, and then do an applied capstone for a real-world client. We've been rolling out this cybersecurity clinic for a few years now. We've done local governments as clients. As you can guess, a lot of need there, especially in terms of ransomware, stuff like that. School corporations, state government agencies, and small businesses. So this is a fun new area. If anybody has any questions about it, I happen to have brochures with me. So now that I can check that box, we can kind of dig into the main topic here. So what got me interested in this stuff? Again, I'm a relative newcomer to this issue of election security, but I've been doing cybersecurity law and policy work somehow for 10 years now, since the dark ages, right back in 2007 when I was a 2L at Stanford. That was the year the iPhone came out. That was also the year, you might recall, of cyber attacks hitting the country of Estonia, which was a big deal at the time because this was one of the most wired nations in the world, right? So that got me really interested in the role of the public and private sectors in managing cyber attacks under international law. In fact, it got me so interested that, God help me, I decided to write a book on the topic because we all know the big money is in academic publishing, after all. And the book is organized around this concept of cyber peace. So flipping the paradigm a bit, not only talking about cyber conflict and war, but what's the best we can realistically hope for in terms of peace on the internet, and how might we be able to get there, like by taking a networked and distributed approach to a networked and distributed problem, in the words of Robert Nackey. And I'll talk a little bit more about cyber peace toward the end, and that's always a fun topic for conversation as well that we can return to if folks are interested. So that's a little bit of background. As far as this particular project, it started life as an op-ed, believe it or not, for the Christian Science Monitor last summer on a pretty straightforward topic. This was kind of on the lead up to our election, and basically arguing that we should classify elections as being at least as important to our society as we do finance or the power grid or healthcare, classifying it, in other words, as critical infrastructure. Ahead, ideally, of the election to help signal how important we think this issue is to other foreign adversaries, right? That didn't happen. It did happen in January, spoiler alert, but that's just the first step, as we'll talk about, because for what it's worth, movie theaters are also classified as critical infrastructure in the US, right? So this is a helpful first step, but certainly not the last step, even though it's sometimes portrayed that way, right? So start life as the op-ed. I got a chance to dig into this for a law review article that's coming out from the University of Michigan in their Journal of Law Reform while I was on sabbatical, hence the Post Veritas kind of logo at the beginning of the slide deck there. And I was able to bring on board lots of different folks from the cybersecurity project, so it's a full team. Michael Suhlmeyer, who directs the cybersecurity project, is on this paper. Bruce Schneier, I want to make sure to call him out. He helped a lot. Ben Buchanan, who's a postdoc at the Belfer Center at Harvard right now, is also on it, as is Annie Bosted. And Amanda Craig, who's a senior cybersecurity strategist at Microsoft. So by no means am I the central piece of this. I'm one of the players in a really collaborative project. So I'll give you my view of it, but again, I want to make sure to give them their credit where it's due because they've helped a tremendous amount with this. The goal of this project was to do a bit of a postmortem. So we really did the heavy lifting of the writing October, November, December. So as you can guess, we had to revise a lot depending on how events were playing out, right? Also to look at, okay, what can we do looking ahead to 2018, 2020 to make this a more manageable problem here in the US, but then to globalize it to talk about how other advanced democracies but also emerging markets are dealing with this issue, right? Because as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is a very live issue right now in France with elections coming up, maybe a runoff in May, and in Germany later this year. So small potatoes issues like the future of the EU could be rolled up into this, right? So we care a lot about it. So we not only did a case study on the US, but we did case studies on Germany, Estonia, India, Brazil, and South Africa to see how this range of democracies are helping to safeguard their own systems and what maybe we can learn from that and what they can learn from us. So that was kind of the focus of this piece. So there you go. Any questions so far? That's kind of the lead up there. Before we kind of dig into the kind of central piece here, I wanted to provide just a touch of background if perhaps you're a little new to the wonderful world of cybersecurity, right? We hear about, of course, cyber attacks, massive data breaches, 1 billion people compromised at Yahoo, whatever the case may be, seemingly every day at this point. But this has been a problem for quite some time now, right? Any guesses on one of the first documented cyber attacks? When do you think it took place? Decade, do you think? Are we 2000s, 90s, 80s, 70s? We probably needed computers first, at least. 60s? Yeah. One of the first documented ones was November 2nd, 1988. When a Cornell grad student infected MIT's network with one of the first logic bombs, right? This guy was prosecuted under the then pretty recent Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, but don't feel too sorry for him. He's now a tenured professor at MIT, as well as a dot-com millionaire. So things didn't work out too poorly for the world's first cyber attacker in a lot of ways, right? This guy is, if you're curious, this is the Morris worm that I'm talking about in Roger Morris, right? So this is a problem that's been around for quite some time now. What's different, of course, is how quickly these attacks are proliferating in numbers, sophistication, and severity, and the fact that they're going after companies and countries alike. As with cyber attacks generally, using cyber means to interfere with foreign elections is also nothing all that new, right? We've been interfering in foreign elections generally for quite some time. One of the studies we looked at for this particular project documented 117 instances when the US and former Soviet Union, Russia, combined to influence the outcome of elections between 1945 and 2000, right? And even using cyber-enabled means isn't that new. So back in 1994, Nelson Mandela's initial victory was diluted because of voter fraud perpetrated by an early cyber attack, right? So that was back in 1994. So again, this is not exactly a new problem. What's new is, of course, we're not used to being the target at the level that we saw this past year, which obviously helps to focus attention pretty quickly. Beyond political parties, as we'll talk about, vulnerabilities are replete across our election infrastructure. More than 3,000 locally managed systems at the state and local level. It's complicated by a really complex threat landscape out there and a widespread, relatively easy to use tools that are in play, and an industry, especially talking about voting machines, that's dominated by pretty small players. The biggest voting machine manufacturer that we were able to identify in the US has just 450 employees. right? And makes in a year what Google makes in a day, right? So we're actually not talking about big fish that have a lot of resources and a lot of expertise to go after and help protect their systems against potentially nation states or organized crime networks, whatever the case may be. Also, of course, there's a lack of cohesive regulation, both here in the US and internationally. So let's dig into that just for a second here in terms of how we vote and how this regulation breaks down. So maybe we could do a quick show of hands. Who used what technology in 2016 to vote? Do you happen to recall if you used optical scan paper ballots? So you had the paper, then you scanned it in. Did anybody use one of these, basically an iPad, like a direct recording electronic device with no paper ballot? Anybody use one of those? Couple people. That's for what it's worth. It's not too far from how the ratio actually breaks down in the US. About 50% of our elections, of the ballots that were actually cast this last fall, used the first technology up there, these optical scan paper ballots. I used that in Indiana as well, for what it's worth, even though it was an absentee ballot coming from Boston, right? About 28% use these direct recording electronic systems. The tricky part is not all of those have paper trails, right? So sometimes you click the button on the screen and that's the end of the story. Other times you click the button and you get a paper print off that you can keep track of, which can of course help quite a bit with post-election audits, right? For example, oh yeah, please go ahead.
Interrupt here in Alameda County.
Yeah.
A few years ago, we briefly went from very old-fashioned paper ballots
Yeah.
to the direct electronic, no paper trail.
And it was a step forward, right? Right.
Apparently it occurred to people that they had problems because briefly it only lasted a few elections, and now we're on the somewhat funkier, somewhat electronic with the scan, but
Sure.
you mark it and you take away the
No, that's exactly it. And that's exactly actually where we're headed as well. Because as you can see across the country, there's really a hodgepodge here. And the focus for a long time, especially after 2000, boy, remember when hanging chads seemed like a big deal? We were much more focused on dealing with that issue, of course, than cybersecurity as part of the Help America Vote Act. Well, that was the last time we spent at the federal level lots of money to help update our voting machines, right? And we're still left with a lot of those legacy systems. Some are still running Windows XP, which is, of course, outdated and unpatched at this point, right? Bit of a problem, right? For example, the University of Michigan, because that's happens to be on my mind right now, a team there was able to break into, at the invitation of DC's voting systems and have the University of Michigan fight song play every time a vote was cast, right? So again, not ideal. So you're right. This has been an issue for some time. We had that piece of legislation, not a lot through Congress since then. There has been some more action at the executive level. So you might recall that DHS wound up providing assistance to all 50 states. All the states requested it from DHS on the lead up to Election Day last year. Some were quite late in the process, but they all requested it. And then in January, we finally had this designation of elections as critical infrastructure. And toward the end here, I'll give you some updates about what's been happening since November, right? But before we do that, I wanted to focus a little bit on the case study, the main beef of it, and I think we can return to this because I'd love to have this be one of our big discussion slides here. What we basically did in this part of the paper was to go through, and again, this is not meant to be comprehensive, but we tried to treat this as what are the top vulnerabilities and some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of policies to deal with some of those problems, right? So no magic bullets here, but hopefully it's a step forward. So we'll go through these 7 vulnerabilities. I'll talk a little bit about the policies that we suggest, okay? And then we can either kind of pause there and discuss them, or maybe I'll just keep going through and we can return to this. Either way works for me. So the first one up there, foreign interference in elections. As we said, that's nothing new. That can be with regards to hacking different political parties, releasing information. Maybe it's accurate, maybe it's not, to help shape the conversation, right? Of course, we saw that with the DNC hack. Second, hackers may try to either delete a limited number of entries in poll books or alter them so that when you go to the polls on election day, if you happen to vote day of, right, that can contribute to really long lines or suppress turnout in other ways, right? So we didn't see this, luckily, happen in 2016, but looking ahead to 2018, 2020, the poll books themselves can be vulnerable, right? And that's another way to undermine trust. Third issue up there, voting machines themselves, right? We talked about these things are quite insecure depending on the jurisdiction we're talking about. In Pennsylvania was often flagged on the run-up to last November as the swing state with the most issues because 47 of their 67 counties use voting machines, those DREs, those direct recording electronic devices, with no paper trail. 47 of their 67 counties, right? So again, in terms of a post-election audit, really tough to actually do and verify the results, right? So that's one especially big point of emphasis for them at the state level looking ahead to 2018 and 2020 to try to help fix that and address that problem. Fourth, the tabulation systems themselves. So these are the things that aggregate the results, right? So we do all this stuff through voting machines. These are the systems that count who voted for what, right? Those can also be amenable to hack. That actually happened in Ukraine back in 2014, right? So in that instance, they were able at the last minute almost to rely on local backups to verify what the tabulation actually should be, right? But ideally, we hopefully won't be in that position to actually catch it at the last minute. But this has been actually done in the real world. Same thing with number 5 up there, hacking into the dissemination of news results, right? So also Ukraine, 2014 election, right? There was a hack of the actual news going to the outlets, and that enabled pretty much all the news networks. They were going to go to press, going to go to air with the false results. That was caught as well at the last minute. Shockingly, the only news station to go with the faked results was a pro-Russia TV station. But this goes to show that even if you don't actually go after the voting machines or the tabulation mechanisms, if you go after the news networks and the news feeds, and CNN, Fox, MSNBC, whatever the case may be, goes with the faked results, that can also have an impact on turnout, especially in democracies like ours with a lot of time zones. You do that in the East Coast, maybe that's going to suppress or promote turnout in other parts of the country, right? So that's something we need to be aware of as well. 6th is a bit of a catch-all, as is 7, right? Critical infrastructure, generally, right? So if you can snarl traffic in certain swing counties, in certain swing states, on or on the run-up to Election Day, that can obviously cause a lot of problems. Same thing, of course, if you turn off the lights or if you do other things with other aspects of critical infrastructure. 7, Internet of Things is a huge area, right? We've seen this crop up more and more. There's a whole separate project that we can talk about if folks are interested that's coming out right now called Wind Toasters Attack that we've been working on. That's looking at healthcare and retail as the 2 big case studies, but it also is just kind of wound up in IoT generally. Actually, another professor at IU and I just did a statement for the Senate Commerce Committee last week on that topic because they had one of their first IoT hearings of the new Congress. We can get into those issues as well if folks are interested. But this can be used as well to launch these distributed denial of service attacks, these DDoS attacks that can, for example, crash certain important websites on the lead up to elections, like where you go to vote, right? If you crash those sites on the day before, the day of, that can also have an impact on turnout, right? So there's a lot of different parade of horribles here. In other words, what in the world can we do to get a better handle on this problem? So we put together a list of 6 different policy recommendations going forward. So what I'll do is I'll go through these and then talk to you guys a little bit about what's been happening in terms of which are actually being implemented before we globalize this discussion and talk about what other countries are doing, right? So what do we recommend? First, keep this designation of voting infrastructure, particularly the voting machines and the tabulation mechanisms, as critical infrastructure. There were some rumblings when the Trump administration first took power that they were going to pull back on this designation. A couple of secretaries of state from a couple of different states, they want to be countries sometimes, like Georgia, have said that we don't really like this critical infrastructure designation because it seems to federalize this process, right? So it's not a settled issue yet. There's still some rumblings, but for now it looks like they're going to keep the designation, but we obviously argue that that's an important signaler, even though it doesn't come with a lot of regulatory teeth behind that. The second thing we argue for is, frankly, more federal funding, definitely throwing more money at this problem, a bit of a race to the top, if you're looking for an analogy when it comes to securing our voting machines, potentially tying in incentives to include audits, paper trail requirements as a matter of state law, since so much of this still is state law, in exchange for those federal dollars. If we don't do that at the federal level, there's a concern that more states are going to go in the direction of Virginia. Right, so already since the 2016 election, we've seen some of the wealthier counties in Northern Virginia invest in more trustworthy voting machines, whereas some of the counties in the southern part of the state, frankly, can't afford to do it. So we're seeing this hodgepodge, right? This bit of a bifurcation of trustworthiness within one state, and that can obviously be replicated across the country, which raises some pretty significant equity concerns. Third, we're arguing for some technical standards, air gapping as much of this infrastructure as possible, implementing things like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework geared mostly for critical infrastructure generally, but it has a lot of crossover to elections. NIST actually put together the first pieces of an election, of actually a voting machine security standards. They tracked back on that before the election actually took place, but there might be some more progress in that domain as well. Number 4, we argue for the creation of a voting ISAC. So what we basically do in the U.S. is for each of our 16 critical infrastructure sectors, we have an information sharing and analysis center attached to it. So this is a way to share cyber threat data and best practices among all these different industries within that sector, right? We don't have one of those for voting yet, but we argue that might make some sense so that these local officials across all these thousands of jurisdictions here in the U.S. could share data a bit more easily on the types of cyber threats that they're seeing and what we can do about it, right? That could start on the U.S. scale, but potentially that could also globalize so that we bring in other countries that are suffering from similar cyber attacks. We'd learn a bit more from them as well. The 5th policy was a bit of a sticky one. What do we do about the next presidential cycle in 2020? Do we, for example, argue for having the Secret Service take ownership, right? Take management authority for the candidates' systems? Or do we potentially provide a subsidy of some kind for the candidates who purchase these services from kind of third-party cybersecurity firms, right? Or do we just do nothing and let things kind of play out as they will? That really kind of split the group. We wound up going for the subsidy approach because there was a bit of a difference of opinion. These were a few days after the 2016 election, so tempers were still quite high, but a lot of folks just didn't like the idea of giving Secret Service that much authority over the presidential systems looking ahead to 2020. But we'll see. Maybe tempers will kind of continue to tamp down. Who knows? Number 6 is a deterrence strategy is obviously critical. We lay this out a little bit in this paper, but we did a follow-up paper as well called From Russia with Love. Sorry, Jack. That's looking at Russian interference in U.S. critical infrastructure, and I could talk more about that, but there's a deterrence piece that especially Michael Suhlmeyer, who's the director of the Cybersecurity Project at the Kennedy School, he took the lead in developing that piece of it. So there you go. That's been a little bit about the policies that we recommend. So what I'll do now is talk about, all right, that's what we recommended. I'd love to hear your thoughts for sure on this, and we can also do some quick updates about what's been going on before I globalize it and talk about what other countries are doing. But yes, question or comment, yeah. Oh, I guess there's a microphone, yeah, there we go.
Having grown up in Is it work? Oh, there. Jeez, scare myself. Having grown up in New York City and then gotten to live under Mayor Daley in Chicago, the first 5 of your 7 vulnerabilities have existed at least since the time of Boss Tweed. You know, ballot boxes floating down the East River, people voting early and often in Chicago. Why? You know, so nothing changes apparently. Does IT provide perhaps the first hope for actually mitigating these?
Potentially. I mean, I wrote the book on cyber peace, so I'm a
do
bit of
it.
an optimist. But yeah, I see where you're going with this, right? So you're absolutely right to point that out. These are problems that democracies generally, including ours, have suffered on for quite some time, especially the top 5, even really the top 6 in some ways, right? So there are opportunities coming from the cybersecurity context to help address some of this stuff. So I'll talk about, for example, Estonia in just a minute. And Estonia has had actually pretty robust, for example, online voting for a while now. About 30% of the votes cast in their last parliamentary election were all online. They can afford to do that because they have a national ID card backed up by public key encryption that we're not likely to have in the U.S. anytime soon, right? So technologically, there's some people do some stuff with some blockchain work at MIT to kind of suss this idea out in the voting context. I've heard kind of mixed things about how that could actually scale. So there are some security standards, some policies that could help with this on the cybersecurity side. But I mean, generally, you're right. These are issues that we've had to deal with. The trick now is that it's just frankly a lot easier to do it, especially from a long way away. You know, you don't have to be actually physically at the ballot box to stuff the ballots, especially for these DREs. You can do it from a distance, right? In fact, in Virginia, there's been cases of actually people being able to drive by and remotely hack into these machines because the security standards are so low.
You might remember in 1948, the Russians actually did try to damage the U.S. election.
Yeah, again, absolutely right. No, again, this isn't, it's not a new thing. Even though we were shocked in 2016, yeah, it's been going on for quite some time. You're absolutely right. Other kind of comments or suggestions about other policies that, you might happen to recommend. I see a hand in the, you can maybe feel free to, yeah. I'd love this to be a two-way street here.
So
Yeah.
it's conspicuous when reading about cybersecurity news
Yeah.
in the private sector
Yeah.
that private researchers from a really big range of institutions, just the infamous guy in his mother's basement even, are
Yeah, this is all done by a 400-pound hacker. we know that.
play a big role in exposing vulnerabilities, pressuring the people, the companies involved to fix them. None of your policy recommendations seem to include the sort of the private researcher who discovers something. Is there any room for that
Absolutely, yeah.
in election protection?
That's a really good point. Yep. Because a lot of these policy responses are either at the federal or state level. And you're right to point out that a lot of the cool stuff that's going on right now is in civil society, or it's private individuals or private companies, frankly, that are getting more on the bandwagon here. And we recognize that. So actually, part and parcel of this work on polycentric governance that I mentioned is how do we get different stakeholders on board from very different sectors to help tackle a common problem. One way that's happening now, you might have heard about this, is Jigsaw, right? So is putting together a cybersecurity group that has actually a list of not only best practices, but kind of a toolkit for election officials. So this is stuff like how to do password alerts, how to do Project Shield as applied to security, how to do two-step authentication. So I think through alliances like that, we're going to see a little bit more of a stepped up process of helping to, for example, certify that some of these are meeting cybersecurity best practices. I've read a little bit about a potential partnership between a nonprofit called Verified Voting, which has done a lot of good stuff in this context. They were actually at RSA in San Francisco talking about this in February, and Google, among others, right? And I think by those types of partnerships, the people that have been doing voting a long time, and some of the tech and security companies that are coming to this now, that could actually help a lot, especially if you're some of these local officials that frankly just don't have the expertise to know which systems to invest in. Yeah.
What would you think about a private cause of action for
Yeah. So potentially, there's a range. I'm so sorry. So the question was about, could there be some type of private cause of actions? Could there be litigation? Could we use liability mechanisms more effectively to go after these types of individuals, right? So here domestically, we have more than 20 different cybercrime laws in the U.S. Some of these are quite broad. I mentioned the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which of course criminalizes unauthorized access, right? Famously. Extremely purposely broad. Stuff like that can absolutely be used in this context. The trick is obviously a lot of this is quite international, so international law is a key piece of this. And we'll be headed there in just kind of toward the end here. So if it's okay, I'll table and I'll return to that when we get there in just a few minutes. But please, yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Barry Belmont. I am one of those people that hums "Hail to the Victor" for every single vote I take. Go Blue. This may be tangential to the larger point, but I think one of the reasons, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we care about hacking in an election is that it undermines the legitimacy of the governed to an extent.
Oh, no, absolutely.
And there's also, tangent to this, there's a vast undermining of the legitimacy by the fact that there's approximately 40% of Americans that don't vote, perhaps aren't registered to vote. There are other policy responses that would sort of address maybe the philosophical implications, requiring the automatic registration of people at the age of 18. If you have to do it for selective service, why not? Voting, why not? The national holiday. Do any of your policy prescriptions or ideas or your results speak to anything that might go to addressing that portion of the legitimacy of the process?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So that's a really good question. We talked about it a little bit in the kind of comparative case study part, which actually will be turning to right after this. So there are other examples out there of how we could do this more effectively. Absolutely. So automatic registration was one of them. Some of you folks might be familiar with Australia and kind of their example, where they don't require you to vote necessarily, but they require that you show up on polling day. And if you don't vote, it's up to you. But as a result of some of those policies, they have extremely high participation rates that we haven't had for decades, frankly. So we didn't get into as much of that, frankly, because this was a symposium piece that was only about 15,000 words, and that this deserves volumes, quite frankly, especially when we get into the comparative dimension here. But I think it's spot on, and I could help a lot to help increase trust and legitimacy in our process, for sure. Maybe we'll do one more at least now, and then we can kind of go through and return to this if we'd like to as well, because it sounds like some folks are interested in the comparative piece, and I want to make sure to do that too.
Did you guys have any discussion about the open source aspect and how that could improve security for these kind of machines? I know that's a big push in a lot of cybersecurity forums.
Yeah, so we did talk about this a little bit. Again, most of the cool work there that we ran into wasn't being done at Harvard, I hate to say, but again at MIT. So we had a couple of those folks over to do kind of a roundtable about the potential there. And yeah, I think there frankly is a lot of potential. The trick is basically convincing local election officials to go along with it at this point. Because there hasn't been a lot of that yet. It's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. So we included that. And if anybody's interested, I'll be happy to send around a link, to the op-ed and the full paper itself, which I think is coming out next month. So it's pretty much all the way done. So there's a little bit of discussion in there, but frankly, we didn't do as much with it as we could have because there is so much else to talk about. But I think absolutely, going forward, there's going to be a lot of room for that. And other countries are already further ahead, frankly, in implementing some of that stuff. So maybe let's turn, if that's okay, to what some other countries are doing. And then we can talk about some international law issues and then return to this, because I'd love to hear more of your ideas on different policies that we could think through here in the U.S. and then kind of couch that in a more global context. So, again, obviously, big deal for us, but we are not the only story, right? There's a lot of countries wrestling with these issues, some more successfully than others. So again, these are the 5 comparative case studies that we did, looking to see how this range of countries is dealing with the problem of election security. And as you can see up there, wide array of responses. What I'll do is just kind of provide a few highlights, and then we can always dig more back in if folks are curious. So take a couple offhand. Germany, Brazil, both used to use electronic voting machines. Not too unlike ours, actually. They don't anymore, right? In Germany, that was in response to a court order. Basically, their voting machines didn't have enough of a paper trail, and there is a German law on the books saying that you have to have transparency in how you audit your elections. Without that paper trail, they weren't able to do that, so they wound up going back exclusively to paper ballots, all right? Compare that to India, and I'll do Brazil. India, they still use electronic voting machines, but similarly, a court order has required that all of these electronic voting machines have paper trails, right? This is an incredible system, by the way. There's some rules in India where you have to be within so many miles of a polling location. They have to set them up all over the country. So there are some quite remote individuals in certain jungles in India, right? And they actually have to have a setup. They trek out. It's a couple-day thing. They set up the polling booth. There was a great podcast about this. If folks are curious, I can send you the link to it. Just so this person can vote. It's a wonderful exercise in democracy, right, and legitimacy. But so India has kept this, required the paper trails. Germany, done away with it, gone back to paper ballots. Brazil also used to use electronic voting machines, and they also have gone back to paper ballots. From what we're able to learn, though, that was primarily for financial reasons rather than security concerns. I don't know exactly what was going on there, but there you go, for what it's worth. We talked about Estonia just briefly. They are kind of at the bleeding edge with regards to especially online voting. They have been for some time. These guys were paying for parking online, right, back in 2007. So you can guess they're very comfortable with this at this point. But again, this is a population of the size of San Diego, right? So different scale. And then, of course, South Africa. There's been a lot of issues, as we mentioned, dating back to 1994 there. The good news is that they've been aware of that because of those issues in 1994 for quite some time and have put in place some pretty robust cybersecurity benchmarks to help with their local voting processes and when they use voting machines as well. So this is a little bit a bit of a snapshot about how other countries are doing this. As you can tell, there's a big movement to either go back to paper ballots or at least require a paper trail to verify election results all around the world. What we did next is to couch this as part of this global discussion on how we can do a better job at safeguarding critical infrastructure, right? So this comes from an analysis of 34 national cybersecurity strategies, which are these high-level documents talking about how this country is going to safeguard our cybersecurity assets, whatever they may be. These were all the countries basically with strategies available in English publicly as of the date that we did it. That's why there's 34, if you're curious. All of the countries we looked to talked about the need for critical infrastructure protection, right? But as you can tell in the bars there, they fell off really quickly in terms of how you do that. So over 50%, for example, talked about the need for more information sharing between the public and private sectors and internationally, right? Only about 20% talked about the need for new regulation to get us there, right? So not a lot of emphasis on black letter law, much more of an emphasis on bottoms-up cybersecurity risk management and frameworks to help implement that, like the NIST cybersecurity framework that I'll talk about in just a second. First, though, really similar story, for what it's worth, in looking at the governance dimension, right? So a lot of countries recognize the need that we need to do a better job here when it comes to governance, right? Quickly, pretty precipitous fall off about how we do that. There's a lot of buzz about, these public-private partnerships. Yeah, there's some talk about that. Again, similar story with expanding laws. Not a lot of emphasis on these strategy documents for that kind of thing, right? There is an emphasis, though, on this and its progeny, basically. So we don't have time to get into the details. If anybody's curious, I'm happy to send around the deck. The top link up there goes to a Harvard Business Review webinar that I did on the NIST cybersecurity framework and how it's impacting negligence and creating a cybersecurity standard of care in the US, right? This was initially for critical infrastructure. So President Obama announced it in his 2013 State of the Union address, right? Came out in 2014, but pretty quickly it's disseminated, right? From the critical infrastructure context to informing basically what we think of as cybersecurity due diligence these days. So much so that a lot of companies are getting the advice that if your cybersecurity standards are challenged during litigation, this is the new benchmark. And if you don't use it, right, you need to have a good story for why not, right? So it's an important data point. So we did that. There's actually a follow-up study, if anybody's curious, on the NIST cybersecurity framework that we're doing right now, looking to see, number one, how it's globalizing, and number two, to actually get some hard data on how companies here in the US and then globally are using it. So first, this is some preliminary results on how this is being globalized. We work with NIST on this. There's 25 countries that we could identify that are now implementing their own versions of this bottom-up cybersecurity framework to help safeguard critical infrastructure, right? Some are basically copying the NIST cybersecurity framework wholesale, large sections of it. Italy is a great example of that, right? Japan as well is going very hard in this direction, as is Australia. The EU, for what it's worth, uses the exact same terminology as the NIST cybersecurity framework does as part of their new Network and Information Security Directive, which is a big deal because for a long time in Europe, they didn't really talk about cyber as an exercise in risk management, right? So this is progress. We're starting to speak the same vocabulary, at least, even if we don't come to the same conclusions necessarily, all right? So this kind of shows that there's a bit of a regulatory spectrum emerging when it comes to cybersecurity. So some countries, US, UK, Italy, Japan, Australia, lots of others, favor this more bottoms-up approach that we just talked about. Other countries, of course, we can talk about Russia. We have experts in the room on that topic. Others favor a much more state-centric approach to cybersecurity. And frankly, the jury's a bit out still. Take one example. The US has more than 3,200 power utilities, right? Any guesses how many Germany has? Principal power utilities? One. The last I saw was basically 4, so a handful, right? So it's a lot easier to get a handful of companies on the same page than 3,200, even where we have more space for experimentation, innovation, the uptake of best practices, right? So clearly, no nation is an island in cyberspace, especially when it comes to election security these days, even though a lot wish they were. There's a really important role for international law here. I'll just mention some developments. We can return to this if folks are curious. There's been a lot of norm-building efforts in this space, right? So the G7, the G20, the UN Group of Government Experts, which is made up of 15 countries and their cybersecurity strategists that come together and talk shop about rules of the road for cyberspace. Even the UN Security Council came up with a resolution about a month ago now on protecting civilian critical infrastructure. So increasingly, we're seeing a lot of really helpful, I think, norm building efforts. The tricky part, the hard work that hasn't been done yet, is operationalizing what do we really mean by critical infrastructure, right? We haven't done the hard work yet of convincing other countries that what we're really talking about here, among other things, is voting and securing elections, right? So that's going to be the tricky next step that I think needs to happen and that we're entering into right now. All of this then is building toward, how can we use these frameworks, use these norms to help build toward this vision of cyber peace, right? So I thought I'd just mention what I mean by this before we kind of wind up and hopefully return and have some nice discussion and questions here. I first read about this concept, believe it or not, as part of a report that the Vatican put out with the World Federation of Scientists a couple of years ago, right? They likened cyber peace, it was a bit pie in the sky, I thought at least, in part as a universal order of cyberspace built on a wholesale state of tranquility. Doesn't that sound nice? Let's do that, right? I just try to be a little bit more maybe reasonable with what we could expect. So I interviewed lots of people for this book that I mentioned. I got back some great responses. Michael Dubose, for example, who used to head up the DOJ cybercrime division, told me cyber peace would be an entire weekend without my BlackBerry going off. Right? This is back when people used BlackBerries, first off. It's a couple of years ago now, right? So again, I don't think we're going to see the end of cyber attacks anytime soon, what you could call a negative cyber peace, generally, or even as applied to elections. But what we can do, I think, is set up a more positive vision that lays the foundation here for cybersecurity due diligence going forward that does a couple things. One, respects human rights. I actually did another article for this same symposium looking at analogies between human rights due diligence and cybersecurity due diligence that we can talk about, including this fun idea of whether or not cybersecurity should be a human right, right? We can talk about that if anybody's interested. Spreading internet access along with cybersecurity best practices and strengthening multi-stakeholder mechanisms, right? So, when we turn the lights on, we expect lights to come on. When we turn the faucet on, we expect water to come out. When we vote for the next leader of the free world, ideally we do so free of foreign entanglements. So none of the policies that we talked about now, I think, are going to be the magic bullet that gets us there, but I think they can help move us in a more productive direction. Because keep in mind that this really is critical infrastructure. Other countries are doing some really useful stuff here that we can mimic. One last example is Australia, right? I did a little bit of work with Australia the last couple of years. They've been able to decrease the incidence of cyber attacks penetrating their governmental networks by 85% by doing three things. So minimizing local admin privileges, so making it harder to log in as an administrator, automatic updating of operating systems and software, and having a pre-approved list of applications that you can run, right? So those three things, 85% of the problems. This stuff doesn't have to be rocket science, just computer science, right? So with that, these are a couple of the references here that we'll talk about. So this first one is the main paper. So this is the full reference. Again, I'm happy to send out links to anybody that's interested. The second one is talking about the Internet of Things, vulnerability issues there. Happy to talk about that if folks are interested too. The third one is talking about the national cybersecurity strategies that we leveraged as part of this analysis as well. The fourth one is the international dimension. This came from a conference that UC Davis hosted about a year and a half ago. And the fifth one is looking at to what extent all this is helping to define a cybersecurity standard of care. As far as what's coming up, a lot of interesting international law developments, so we can get more into that if anybody would like to. That's coming out here in Chicago. We are doing some fun stuff on blockchain now, so happy to talk about that more. This was the deterrence piece there. You might notice Jackie on this one as well, talking about encryption and the Apple saga there. This was the due diligence piece. We are doing a new NIST cybersecurity framework project right now. It's the first national survey to see how companies are actually using and tailoring this framework. So we're hoping to get some hard data on how that is actually varies across sector and what that means in terms of whether or not we need to offer more incentives to help drive adoption or not. We might not, frankly, because a lot of companies, for example, like Microsoft, are requiring that companies use this if they do as part of their supply chain management, basically, as part of doing business with them. And then got a new book working on as well. So way too much information, bit of a fire hose. So I'm happy to go back to any of that, whether it's the international law side, whether it's kind of more domestic policies, or related issues like IoT. So I'll cast the net wide here and just kind of invite you to comment or critique, hopefully, as you'd like to.